Welcome, everybody. This is the Great Books Mini Lectures here at Johnson County Community College. This is our third and final lecture of this semester. And those of you who have been with us since September, we want to thank you for keep coming back to us. We will have three more in the spring. We ask that you join us in February when Professor Monica Hogan speaks on Octavia Butler's The Parable of the Sower. My name is Michael Carragher. I'm an assistant professor in the English department, and along with Professor Maureen Fitzpatrick, we've curated this year's Great Books series. And we are very excited with today's presentation. Eve Blebaum is professor of sociology here at JCCC. She completed a bachelor's in psychology from the University of Nebraska. She earned a master's of science in criminology from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and she's completed all but the dissertation on a PhD in sociology, also at UMKC. This December, if that wasn't enough, she'll be completing a master's of education in educational leadership from Northern Arizona University. Eve joined the college 18 years ago, and she's been on full-time faculty for the past 13 years. She teaches a number of courses, including Sociology of Families, Honors Introduction to Sociology, Honors Social Problems, and Sociology of Community. She's active with the Midwest Sociological Society, and she often organizes transgender awareness presentations on campus each April and November. She is an integral part of this college community. Aside from her duties at the college, Eve enjoys podcasts, audiobooks, her kids' sports, activities, and naps. It's quite a list. For our presentation today, Professor Blebaum she's chosen to speak on Vladimir Nabokov's 1955 novel, Lolita, a book that has certainly sparked a lot of discussion and interest over the years. Of the book, she says, Lolita really impressed upon me how easily blinded by emotion and manipulated people can be. This was something I knew in an abstract, theoretical sense, but I didn't fully absorb it until reading and discussing this book in my college 20th century literature course. It was also the first time I'd ever really considered the limitations that language can impose on thought. And I think that really does cut not just to the heart of the novel, but to a lot of Nabokov's efforts, a master of language and multiple languages, in fact. At the end of her remarks today, we may have some time for discussion, as we have all semester. We're going to be holding to a pretty tight time limit. So we'll wrap up probably at 45 minutes. But if time allows and she's willing, we'll have some questions. So please keep that in mind. Friends, Eve Blebaum.
All right. Can everybody see and hear everything here? Okay. So this first quote that I have from the book, she was low, plain low in the morning, standing 4 feet 10 in one sock. She was Lola in slacks. She was Dolly at school. She was Dolores on the dotted line. But in my arms, she was always Lolita. So her name is one of the themes that we'll talk about a little bit later. So this is Vladimir Nabokov as a child. He was born in what was then Petrograd, but now St. Petersburg, Russia, in April of 1899. He's the eldest of 5 children, and he was raised trilingual and spoke Russian, English, and French fluently. And I read that to his patriotic father's disappointment, he could read and write in English before he could in Russian. After the February 1917 revolution in Russia forced the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II, Nabokov's father became the secretary for the Russian Provisional Government, which was made up primarily of business owners, capitalists, aristocrats, and noblemen. And they generally supported continuing to fight against Germany. So then after the Bolsheviks overthrew the provisional government in October of the same year, Nabokov's family fled to Crimea where they thought they wouldn't have to stay long. They believed that would be temporary. They ultimately had to seek refuge in Western Europe, and Nabokov enrolled at Cambridge University. Then in 1920, his family moved to Berlin, where he would join them after he completed his BA at Cambridge. His father was a proud Russian patriot and a classical liberal who rejected both fascism and communism. And he was actually shot and killed in March of 2022 by a Russian monarchist. He at the time was not the target of the shot, but he was shielding the person who was being targeted. So after that happened, Nabokov's mother and sister moved to Prague, but Nabokov himself remained in Berlin for 15 years. During his time in Berlin, he wrote his first 9 novels, which were all written in Russian. He also met in 1923 and married in 1925 a Russian Jewish woman named Vera Slonim, and their only child, Dmitry, was born in 1934. Nabokov's last work of Russian fiction was a 1939 novella called The Enchanter, which was written during the relatively short time, just 3 years, that he lived with his family in France. He would later call The Enchanter the first little throb of Lolita. In May 1940, as the German army advanced, Nabokov, with his wife and son, fled to the United States. They originally settled in Manhattan, and Vladimir, who had studied zoology at Cambridge, volunteered at the American Museum of Natural History as an entomologist. He was a lifelong lover of butterflies in particular, and he was considered an expert lepidopterist. The Nabokov family, he began lecturing at Wellesley College in 1941, and he's widely credited with founding the Russian department there. The resident lecturer position was created for him, and it gave him the time and income to write and study butterflies. During his time in the United States, he also would teach at Cornell University, where Ruth Bader Ginsburg was among his students. And he also curated a lepidoptery collection at the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology. Each summer, Nabokov would make trips to the Western United States to collect butterflies. And it was on those trips that he began refining The Enchanter into what would become Lolita. And he finished it in December of 1953. Following the financial success of Lolita, Nabokov and his wife returned to Europe, where he would focus on writing and butterflies. They actually moved into the 6th floor of a hotel in Switzerland in 1961 and lived there until he died in July of 1977. That's just a little bit about his background. I also read that the accidental death, shooting death of his father was kind of a theme that he came back to in multiple works as well. So because of its content, Lolita was initially turned down by multiple American publishers, which left Nabokov with little choice but to seek publication elsewhere. It was ultimately published in 1955 by Olympia Press, which was a French publishing house. It was known for erotic fiction, but Nabokov did not know that. He was unfamiliar with it. He had originally planned to publish Lolita using a pseudonym, but against the advice of a friend, he ultimately signed a contract with Olympia to publish the book using his own name. Lolita came out in 2 slim green volumes with an initial printing of 5,000 copies. It was mostly ignored between September and December of 1955. But in December of 1955, the London Sunday Times ran a piece by Graham Greene that called Lolita one of the 3 best books of 1955. That provoked a rebuke from the London Sunday Express, whose editor called the book sheer unrestrained pornography and the filthiest book I've ever read, after which it was banned in the UK, and France followed suit in 1956, banning the book. The American audience mostly didn't pay a lot of attention to it. And the first American edition of Lolita was published by G.P. Putnam's Sons in 1958. And it became the first book since Gone with the Wind to sell 100,000 copies within the first 3 weeks. Lolita has been adapted into 2 movies, 1962, which was a Stanley Kubrick film, and 1997, a musical, an opera, 2 ballets, and 4 plays. It is also referenced in multiple other books and films, as well as in popular music. So a little bit about the basic contours of the plot. The novel opens with a fictitious foreword by John Ray Jr., PhD, who edits psychology books. And in this fictitious foreword, Dr. Ray says that he has received a manuscript, part memoir, part legal defense, written by a man, Humbert, who died of coronary thrombosis, which is a blood clot in the heart, while awaiting the start of his trial for murder. So Humbert then narrates the memoir, which is the bulk of the novel. He opens by sharing a little bit about his birth and his upbringing, including a story about his first love, Annabelle. Humbert and Annabelle are basically 2 horny teenagers who are attempting to escape adult supervision in order to, quote unquote, possess one another. So they find a lonely, isolated patch of beach hidden away by some red rocks forming a kind of cave. And just as they're about to satisfy their desire for one another, 2 men emerge from the water with what he calls exclamations of ribald encouragement. And the disruption puts an end to their tryst. And then 4 months later, Annabelle dies of typhus. Humbert speculates about whether this experience and his unsatiated desire for Annabelle is what somehow created in him a sexual interest in nymphets, a word that Nabokov coined in Lolita, that seems to suggest a certain sensuality about these girls, and even hints at voluntary participation in their own objectification and exploitation. And the rest of Humbert's memoir unfolds this way. As an English teacher and writer, Humbert is moving to a small town in New England to work on his book. The place he had initially planned to stay is destroyed by a fire, and in searching for a different place to rent, Humbert meets Charlotte Hayes, who is a widow that is taking tenants. He agrees to see the place, but plans to decline any offers from Charlotte. But when she takes him to her garden, her daughter Dolores is laying out in the sunshine. Humbert is instantly smitten and decides to move on. While Humbert is apparently trying to find sneaky ways to fulfill his sexual desires for 12-year-old Dolores, Charlotte is falling in love with him. And when Dolores is away at a summer camp, Charlotte confesses her feelings for Humbert and demands that he either marry her or move out immediately. Though he is initially unnerved by the idea, he begins to see new possibilities in becoming Dolores' stepfather, so he agrees to marry her mother. Later on, after they're wed, Charlotte discovers and reads Humbert's diary, in which he confesses his feelings for Dolores and disgust for her mother. Horrified and humiliated, Charlotte confronts Humbert, who tries to convince her that the writings are actually a sketch for a future novel. She doesn't believe him and decides to run away with Dolores after mailing letters to her friends warning them about Humbert. But as she runs out of the house to mail the letters, she is hit by a car and killed. Humbert collects the letters and picks Dolores up from camp, telling her that Charlotte is seriously ill and in the hospital, and that they're headed there to visit. The 2 of them check into a fancy hotel where he plans to drug and rape Dolores. It turns out, however, that the drugs he was given are too weak to completely knock her out, so he can't take advantage of her as he had hoped. Instead, he lies on the bed next to her and stews throughout the night. As she's waking up the next morning, he pretends to have been asleep too, and they start to kiss. Then Dolores propositions him. In his uncertainty, he reveals to her that he is still a virgin, and she engages him in emotionally detached intercourse. We then learn that while she was his first lover, he was not hers. And he says, "Why then this horror that I cannot shake off? Did I deprive her of her flower? Sensitive gentlewomen of the jury, I was not even her first lover." As Humbert and Dolores continue their journey toward an imaginary hospital to visit Charlotte, Dolores's mother, Humbert worries about what has happened, but also acknowledges that at the same time, he wants to have intercourse with her again. He hopes to find a quiet place to pull over. Dolores wants to use a washroom, after which she wants to call her mother, and Humbert blurts out the truth. "You can't call that number. Your mother is dead." A bit further down the road, they stop for the night. Humbert lavishes her with gifts and rents them each separate rooms. In the middle of the night, Dolores comes to his room sobbing. "We made it up very gently," he tells the reader. You see, she had absolutely nowhere else to go. This is how part one of the novel ends. So then in part two of Lolita, Humbert and Dolores continue traveling. She's often moody and sullen, and he tries to maintain her interest in him and bribes her occasionally for sexual favors. They ultimately settle in New England, where they basically live as father and daughter. Humbert enrolls her in a private girls' school, but because he is jealous, he severely limits her social interactions. The headmaster thinks that Humbert is a conservative European father and talks him into allowing Dolores to participate in a school play. But a few days before the play is to debut, Dolores and Humbert have a serious argument and she runs out. When he finds her, she tells him she wants to return to their life on the road. At first, Humbert loves having Dolores all to himself again, but as they travel, he becomes suspicious that they're being followed by someone Dolores knows. It turns out they're being trailed by Claire Quilty, who is a friend of Charlotte's and a famous playwright. When they're in Colorado, Dolores becomes sick and Humbert checks her into a hospital, from which she disappears. He is told she was checked out by her uncle, but he knows this can't be true because she has no living relatives. He desperately searches, but fails to locate her. 2 years pass before he receives a letter from a Mrs. Richard F. Schiller, which he learns is Dolores's married name. Now 17, she's married, pregnant, and in need of money. Armed with a pistol, Humbert tracks her down and gives her an inheritance from her mother. She tells him that her husband is a deaf mechanic and was not the one who abducted her from the hospital. In fact, she was taken by Claire Quilty, whom she loved, but he rejected her when she refused to star in his pornographic movie. Dolores refuses to leave her husband, but Humbert goes to Quilty's mansion and shoots him dead. And this is the murder for which he's awaiting trial when he dies in jail. Humbert concludes his memoir by stating how he is still in love with Dolores and he wants his memoir to be released only after her death, which he anticipates will probably be many years after his. But as the reader already knows from the foreword, Dolly Schiller would die giving birth to a stillborn girl on Christmas Day in 1952. So Humbert's memoir leaves us pretty much right back where we began, which is in this fictitious foreword. And the foreword highlights at least two things. First, that Humbert's memoir is largely unreliable and self-delusion. And second, there's not explicit content in the memoir. Dr. Ray writes, not a single obscene term is to be found in the whole work. And he does note that some anecdotes can be described as aphrodisiac, but he is also clear that if any of the content had been sexually explicit enough to require any editing or redaction, he could not be sharing the memoir at all. So what can we make of this? First of all, readers with a keen eye will have noticed Nabokov's use of wordplay throughout the novel. One character's name, Vivian Darkbloom, Vivian Darkbloom being Claire Quilty's mistress, is actually an anagram, so the same letters rearranged in a different order, for Vladimir Nabokov. A psychiatrist, Dr. Blanche Schwarzman's name can be translated because Blanche is French for white and Schwarz is German for black. So Dr. Blanche Schwarzman becomes Dr. White Blackman, which indicates a belief that psychiatrists see things in black and white. Nabokov also uses alliteration throughout the novel. Examples include Humbert Humbert, Gaston Godden, Mesmer, and Harold D. Doublename. In addition to character names, he also does this with place names such as Hazy Hills, Comfy Cabins, Hobby House, Raspberry Room, and Pierre Point. The novel also contains multiple references to Edgar Allan Poe. Humbert's first love is Annabel Lee, Leigh, which recalls Poe's poem titled Annabel Lee, Lee. Poe himself used a lot of wordplay. Poe also married his 13-year-old cousin. Early in the novel, Humbert narrates a scene where he is just beginning to spend time around Dolores as a boarder in her mother's house. She's playing with an apple, tossing it in the air, and he intercepts it. She's playful, pleading with him to give it back and holding out her open hands, palms up. I produced delicious. She grasped it and bit into it. This can be interpreted as a reference to the Garden of Eden in the fall of man, in which Eve seduces Adam with an apple. Humbert is suggesting here that Dolores seduced him, that she was not his innocent victim. We see this theme again after they've had intercourse for the first time, and he proclaims that I was not even her first lover, when we also know that she was his. She is more sexually experienced than he. The numbers 342, 42, and 52 all recur in the novel. Examples include Charlotte Hayes's house number, which is 342. When Dolores disappears from the hospital, Humbert visits 342 hotels and motels searching for her. Claire Quilty has written 52 plays. Humbert and Dolores both die in 1952. He also uses a lot of puns. I mentioned before, Dolores's name and nicknames are used in puns, such as spending his doleful days in dumps and dollars, which is also an example of alliteration, and referring to my dolorous and hazy darling. All of these words have meanings related to suffering and are plays on Dolores's name. In other words, her name is not a coincidence. It's a reference to her pain and sadness. Nabokov also uses ironic puns, such as when he informs Dolores's summer camp that he'll be picking her up because, as the reader knows, her mother is dead. But he tells the camp that, quote, her mother was hospitalized, that the situation was grave, that the child should not be told it was grave. He plays with the word grave and even uses it twice to emphasize the irony. So just so you know, this is my copy of the annotated Lolita, and easily a third of this, of these pages are dedicated to outlining and identifying all of the different kinds of wordplay that he uses in here. You could write for months and months, probably without covering all of it. In 1956, Nabokov penned an afterword to Lolita, which appeared in the first American edition and has been included in all subsequent printings. In it, he describes the initial shiver of inspiration for the book. He says, as far as I can recall, the initial shiver of inspiration was somehow prompted by a newspaper story about an ape who, after months of coaxing by a scientist, produced the first drawing ever charcoaled by an animal. The sketch showed the bars of the poor creature's cage. So we already know that Humbert Humbert is an unreliable narrator. His memoir is written essentially to justify his sexual abuse of Dolores, a girl he intentionally made his stepdaughter, attempted to drug and rape, and with whom he has committed multiple acts of statutory rape. He has deliberately isolated her from peers because he wanted her for himself. There is no sense in which this relationship can be considered appropriate or acceptable, and Humbert knows this. He feels it in his gut, even as he tries to convince himself it was she who seduced him. Particularly in the Me Too era, in which we grapple with themes of gender, power, and sexual misconduct. But even well before the 21st century, the plot of Lolita is profoundly troubling. Humbert is manipulating the reader's understanding for his own self-interest, maybe even his own self-preservation. But in Lolita, the reader is also unreliable. Nabokov anticipated, even actively solicited, characterizations of the book as obscene. He intentionally constructs a story that is offensive. But when the reader responds by getting upset or angry by the plot, we are being manipulated by Nabokov. So whether we find ourselves sympathizing with Humbert or despising him, either way, we're being manipulated. We're trapped by language, just as the ape is trapped by the bars of its cage. So when I read this novel for my 20th century literature course as an undergrad, the notion of being trapped by language really intrigued and stuck with me, but I didn't have the ability to articulate it. Knowing more now about how scholars study language, it's a bit clearer to me. One example of this is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis in anthropology, which argues that thought is controlled by language. There's not a lot of empirical support for this sort of extreme formulation, but it's still useful for considering the ways in which our language confines us. Can we think without language? Yes, but can we really communicate our thoughts without it? That's more difficult. A car exists without a driver, but it doesn't go anywhere. Likewise, our ability to discuss ideas or even exchange information can be limited by our language. So a couple of examples how to describe long-term committed non-married couples. The English language generally hasn't had a word for that, where you're not husband and wife, but you're not boyfriend and girlfriend. And we're getting more comfortable now with the use of the word partners, but that's relatively new development. In Spanish, there's no real direct translation for what in English we call a boyfriend or a girlfriend. You're friends, or you have like a serious, almost engaged or married relationship. It's also worth pointing out that Nabokov once responded to an American critic who called Lolita a record of Nabokov's love affair with the romantic novel. Nabokov said it would be more accurate if you replaced romantic novel with English language. And you have to keep in mind that this is a man who spoke 3 languages and wrote in all 3. There are many French words and phrases, even idioms, throughout Lolita. And if you can translate the French, which I cannot, it adds a whole new layer to what he's doing with language. This is all meticulously crafted and constructed, which Nabokov himself noted in an interview with Life magazine. I would say that of all my books, Lolita has left me with the most pleasurable afterglow, perhaps because it is the purest of all, the most abstract and carefully contrived. And then I think this, his whole purpose in this novel is summed up really well by this quote. He says, "Oh, my Lolita, I have only words to play with." That's it. We have time for questions.
Eve, thank you so much. As she just said, if any of you have questions about the novel, about Nabokov, please. We have time to entertain those.
I have a question. This is Kathleen O'Neill. And as a criminologist and considering the protagonist or antagonist, Humbert, what do you think is the worst crime that he committed?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think morally, probably making her his stepdaughter and then still trying to engage in a sexual relationship with her. There's even a scene in the book where he's talking about whether or not when they check into this fancy hotel, it's expensive. And so he gets only one room. And he's talking about whether it's okay with her that they are going to share a room. And she basically says there's a word for it and it's incest. But they go ahead and do it anyway. So for me, morally, that's probably the biggest issue. But like from a criminology perspective, I would say attempting to drug and rape someone is probably at the top of my list. And I had honestly forgotten that part when I went back to look at this, because I took this course over 20 years ago now. And so I had forgotten that little detail that he's uncomfortable with the idea of having sex with her consent. And so his plan is to just knock her out and do it, which is, I mean, I don't even have words to describe how messed up that is. And, you know, obviously even in the 50s, when it was pretty normal for teens to be married and pregnant, this is out there. It's very out there. And I remembered it being out there, but I kind of forgot how extreme it was.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you, Kathleen. Anyone else? We have a question in the chat. It says Humbert Humbert tried to convince the audience of his innocence. Do you think he ever convinces himself?
I don't. Throughout, he sort of indicates guilt, and like that one passage that I read where he's basically saying, well, I don't understand why I feel so terrible and awful and guilty about this because I wasn't even her first. I don't think he's ever comfortable with it. Even toward the end, he says some pretty I don't know if self-deprecating is the word when you really are kind of garbage. I don't think he ever convinces himself. I think he's always got, no matter what he's telling himself in his brain, I think his heart always knows that it's not okay.
You mentioned possible sympathy for that character. And I think you're right. Obviously, one of the tricks as a writer is to use first person perspective. We give a lot of support over to a character telling us their story. But it may be difficult for those who have not read the novel to actually consider that we might in some ways pull for him or see him in a sympathetic light. Can you tell us any more about how you think Nabokov pulls that off? Not that all readers do, but
yeah, he's sort of an unfortunate guy, and so he's sort of an underdog, I think, from the beginning, and so Nabokov constructs it in a way that you want him to find something to set him free from this, ideally not actually achieving his goals, but you sort of want him to find like real love with an adult, maybe. He is a sympathetic character, even though what he's doing is just awful. But I think maybe part of that is that he does know it's awful, and he says that he knows it's awful. And there maybe is a sense in which we can kind of buy into his own theory or hypothesis about why he's attracted to these nymphets, which he has an explicit definition. I think he called like girls between 9 and 14. And they have a specific look to them. They sort of, and you can imagine, I mean, this is an age in which maybe a young woman or a young girl knows that she's beginning to develop more traits of a woman. She can be aware of boys or men gazing at her in a particular way. And so maybe she's exploring that and playing around with what new abilities to control people in situations does this give her. And so I think it's sort of possible to see him as just this unfortunate guy who is still psychologically wrecked from losing maybe his real love of his life was Annabelle. And he never actually gets to be with her in the way that he wants and she wants. And then she's just suddenly gone. So I think I wouldn't call him a sympathetic character, but there are sympathetic elements maybe to his story.
sure.
But again, you know, he's an unreliable narrator. So how do we know how much of this crap is even real?
We have another question in the chat. Eve, can you comment on any of the social reactions to the novel? Reviewers certainly, but the general public, And this comment says, I'm sure it's been at the top of a lot of censorship lists, and it continues
Well,
to be today. Yes.
yeah, so I actually thought that it had been at one time banned in the United States, and it doesn't look like that was ever the case. It was, as I said, banned in Europe and in France. But at the same time, it seems like reviewers generally kind of got what he was doing and liked it even from the get-go. And readers, he even says it in an interview somewhere, that in his view, people bought it and thought it was going to be erotic fiction. And then when it wasn't, they kind of got a little bored. Like, there were people who wanted to read this tawdry, sordid tale. And then when they found that there weren't like explicit descriptions of sexual intercourse between an adult man of 40-ish and a 12-year-old, that they were a little disappointed. So I think it's kind of interesting because you have, I mean, in my mind, the people who really didn't ever read it, who just heard what it was about, but didn't really have any idea what he was actually doing. Because I think this is a book that's not about the plot, right? In a very
Right.
general sense, this is not at all what it's about. But if all you heard was the plot, you could get very upset. And particularly in the current political and social environment where we actually are having conversations about which books should and should not be in school libraries or libraries. I mean, I think it's still pretty easy to imagine this happening. People who haven't read it get all upset. People who want to read it maybe don't want to admit that they want to read it, but then they get a little bored when it's not what they expected. And the reviewers read it and they get it and they like it.
I think that's accurate. You know, that play on language is incredibly subversive,
Mhm.
but not in the way that most people think it's subversive. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if I was actually to read this book again, I'm really glad that my college professor didn't assign the annotated version because there are so many annotations. It's absolutely distracting. You have to either read the annotations or you have to read the book. You can't really read them both in, you know, in tandem. It's too much to keep track of, really.
We probably have time for one or two more questions if they are out there.
Eve,
Yes.
if you have seen the movies, how does the is it possible to do an unreliable narrator in something as concrete as film?
I have not seen the movies. I'm intrigued because Kubrick, right? And then also I really like Jeremy Irons, and so he was Humbert in the 97 version, and a very young Melanie Griffith was, I believe, Lolita. So I'm interested in seeing the movies, but I never have. But having said that, you know, I can think of some movies where things are not quite what they seem. What's the movie where the guy tattoos himself? Memento. I really like that movie. That's a very good movie. And it's constructed sort of, you watch it backwards in time. And so you don't realize what's really going on. But even something like The Adjustment Bureau, where there's sort of action and plans and structures that are hidden from the characters. The audience knows, but the characters don't. But yeah, I am a little curious to see how that's done in film. I imagine the films are a little bit more about the plot and a little bit less about the wordplay, because yeah, I don't really know. I don't really know how that comes across. I think the idea that it's socially constructed or self-delusion, I think that can come across, but the wordplay I don't know about.
Well, Eve, thank you so much for this presentation. It was a wonderful way to finish up this semester. Thank you to everybody who attended today, and thank you to everybody who will watch this in the future. If you just can't wait till February, check out our YouTube page where all of the previous lectures are housed. We go back now, Maureen, I think it's almost 6 years. 5 or 6 years. So we've been doing this now for a while, and there are some wonderful lectures out there to get you through maybe these colder months, but we do hope to see you through February. Eve, thanks again. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.